The train rattled through the Illinois countryside, and Klaus Hoffmann pressed his face against the cold window. Everything looked wrong. The farms were intact. The fields were green. There were no bomb craters, no burned villages, no refugees walking along the roads. After 2 years of war in North Africa and the hell of the Atlantic crossing in the cramped ship hold, America seemed like a different planet. Klaus was 28 years old, a Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down over Tunisia in the spring of 1943. The British had captured him first, then shipped him across the ocean with hundreds of other German prisoners. During the voyage, the older soldiers had told stories about what happened to POWs. They spoke of starvation, beatings, forced labor until you dropped dead. Klaus had seen what happened to Russian prisoners in German camps. He expected the same treatment here, but when the train stopped at Camp Ellis, nobody hit them. Nobody screamed. An American colonel with gray hair and tired eyes stood on the platform. His name was Patterson, and he spoke to them in broken German. "You're prisoners of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work, but you'll be fed. You'll be housed properly. You will not be harmed. Do not try to escape. Do not cause trouble. Follow the rules, and you will be safe." Klaus did not believe him. It had to be a trick. The camp was nothing like he expected. The barracks were wooden but sturdy. Each prisoner had a real bed with a mattress and 2 blankets. There was a mess hall that served hot food twice a day. The portions were small, but it was real food, not the watery soup he had eaten in the British holding camp. There was even a recreation area where prisoners could play cards or write letters home. The German officers were separated from regular soldiers, but Klaus was housed with other Luftwaffe pilots and crew members. His bunkmates were Friedrich, a baby-faced 19-year-old from Bavaria who had been captured after his tank broke down in Sicily, and Otto, a 45-year-old veteran who had fought in the First War and somehow ended up in this one too. "They fatten us up before they kill us," Otto said on the first night. "Trust nothing. Remember, we are still the enemy." But weeks passed, and nobody killed them. Instead, Colonel Patterson announced that prisoners would be assigned to work details. America had sent millions of men to fight in Europe and the Pacific. The farms needed workers. The factories needed workers. The German POWs would fill the gap. "You will earn 80 cents per day," Patterson explained through a translator. "You will work Monday through Saturday. Sunday is a rest day. Any prisoner who works hard and causes no trouble will be treated fairly." Klaus was assigned to a farm owned by a family named Morrison. The farm was 20 miles from the camp, surrounded by cornfields that stretched to the horizon. On the first morning, an army truck drove Klaus, Friedrich, and Otto down dusty roads to the property. An American guard with a rifle sat in the back with them, but he looked bored, not hostile. Robert Morrison was a tall man with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin. He was maybe 50 years old, with gray streaks in his brown hair. He nodded at the 3 Germans and pointed toward the barn. "You will help with the harvest," he said simply. "Start there." They worked loading hay bales onto a wagon. It was hard labor, but Klaus had done worse. The September sun beat down on them, and sweat soaked through their POW uniforms. The guard sat in the shade of a tree, smoking cigarettes and reading a newspaper. Around noon, a woman came out of the farmhouse carrying a basket. She was perhaps 40, with brown hair tied back and a simple blue dress. This was Eleanor Morrison, Robert's wife. She spread a blanket under a tree and unpacked sandwiches, apples, and a jug of cold water. "Lunch," she said, gesturing for them to sit. Klaus looked at Otto, confused. Were they supposed to eat with the family? In Germany, prisoners ate separately, often after the guards had eaten. But Eleanor Morrison was looking at them expectantly, so they sat down awkwardly on the grass. The sandwiches were thick with ham and cheese. Klaus could not remember the last time he had eaten meat like this. He forced himself to eat slowly, to not look desperate. Friedrich ate 3 sandwiches in minutes. Otto ate carefully, suspiciously, as if the food might be poisoned. "You are from Germany?" Eleanor asked in halting German. Her accent was terrible, but she was trying. "Yes," Klaus replied carefully. "Do you have family there?" Klaus nodded. "My mother and sister. In Dresden." Eleanor smiled sadly. She said something in English that Klaus did not understand, then returned to the house. That evening, as the truck drove them back to camp, Klaus saw something that made his chest tighten. Through the Morrisons' kitchen window, he had glimpsed a photograph on the mantel. A young man in an American Army uniform, smiling at the camera. The Morrisons had a son at war. They were feeding German prisoners while their own son was fighting Germans somewhere in Europe. Klaus did not understand these Americans at all. Over the following weeks, they fell into a routine. Wake at dawn, truck to the farm, work until sunset, return to camp. The work was endless. Harvesting corn, repairing fences, mucking out the barn, moving equipment. But Robert Morrison worked beside them, never asking them to do anything he would not do himself. Eleanor brought lunch every day. Sometimes she brought cookies or pie. The local townspeople were different. When they drove through the small town to reach the farm, Klaus saw how people stared. Some faces showed curiosity. Others showed hatred. An old woman spit on the ground as the truck passed. A man shouted something angry in English. These people had sons and brothers fighting overseas. They had every reason to hate German prisoners, but the Morrisons never showed hatred. They showed something Klaus did not have a word for in English. It was not quite kindness. It was not quite pity. It was something else. Something that made him deeply uncomfortable because it reminded him that he was supposed to see Americans as the enemy, as inferior as everything the propaganda had told him. Yet every day, Eleanor Morrison brought them lunch and asked about their families. Every day, Robert Morrison worked beside them like equals. And every night, Klaus returned to camp more confused than before. What kind of war was this, where the enemy fed you sandwiches and asked about your mother? 3 weeks had passed since Klaus first arrived at the Morrison farm. The November air was getting colder, and the harvest work was nearly finished. Klaus had learned to understand some English words. Good morning, water, break time, simple things. Friedrich had learned even more because he was young and his brain soaked up the new language like a sponge. The work routine had become familiar. Wake before dawn. Eat the camp breakfast of watery oatmeal and black coffee. Load into the truck with the other prisoners. Ride through the awakening countryside to the farm. Work until your back ached and your hands bled. Eat Eleanor's lunch. Work until sunset. Return to camp. Sleep. Repeat. But something was changing in the town. Klaus noticed it during their daily drives. At first, everyone had stared with suspicion or anger. Now some people waved. A shopkeeper nodded as they passed. A child pointed excitedly at the truck, and his mother did not pull him away. The prisoners were becoming part of the landscape, as normal as the changing leaves and the cooling weather. Other prisoners from the camp worked at different farms. In the evenings, they shared stories. Most reported similar treatment. Hard work, but fair. Decent food. No beatings. No torture. It was nothing like what they had expected, nothing like what happened in the camps back in Europe. Otto remained suspicious. They treat us well because they want something, he said one night as they played cards in the barracks. Or because they are weak. The Fuhrer was right about American softness. But Klaus was not so sure anymore. He had seen Robert Morrison's hands, cracked and scarred from decades of farm work. He had seen a man lift hay bales that weighed as much as a small person. There was no weakness there, only hard work and quiet strength. On a Saturday evening, something unexpected happened. The workday was ending. Klaus, Friedrich, and Otto were loading tools into the barn when Eleanor Morrison approached them. She looked nervous, twisting her apron in her hands. She spoke to Klaus in her broken German. Tomorrow is Sunday, she said. Church day. Rest day. Klaus nodded. He knew this. Sundays, they stayed at camp. No work? Eleanor took a deep breath. Would you come to our house? For dinner? Sunday dinner. The words hung in the cold air. Klaus stared at her, certain he had misunderstood. Friedrich's mouth fell open. Otto's eyes narrowed with instant suspicion. Dinner. Klaus repeated in German, then tried the English word. Dinner. Yes, Eleanor said. She was definitely nervous now. My family. We want to invite you. You work hard. You are far from home. Tomorrow, come for Sunday dinner. 2 o'clock. She said something in English to the guard, who shrugged and nodded. Klaus did not know what to say. In his 2 years as a soldier, in all his training, in everything the Nazi Party had taught him, nothing had prepared him for this moment. The enemy did not invite you to dinner. The enemy did not look at you with kind eyes and nervous hope. The enemy was supposed to hate you. Klaus started, then stopped. Thank you. Eleanor smiled, relieved. Good. Tomorrow. 2 o'clock. She hurried back to the house, got on the truck, ride back to camp. Nobody spoke. Finally, Otto broke the silence. It is a trap. How can dinner be a trap? Friedrich asked. I do not know, but it is something. Maybe they will poison us. Maybe they will interrogate us. Maybe it is a test from the camp command. Klaus said nothing. He was thinking about that photograph on the mantel. The Morrison's son in his army uniform. Where was he now? France? Italy? Fighting against Germans. Maybe even fighting against someone Klaus knew. And yet they invited a German pilot to their Sunday dinner. That night, Klaus could not sleep. He lay in his bunk and listened to the sounds of the barracks. Snoring, coughing, someone crying quietly in the dark, homesick for Germany. Outside, the Illinois wind rattled the windows. Klaus thought about his mother in Dresden. He had received one letter from her in 6 months, so heavily censored by both the German and American authorities that half the words were blacked out. She was alive. That was all he knew. Dresden was being bombed now. The British were hitting German cities night after night. His mother was living through the same hell that London had endured in 1940. And here he was, a prisoner in America, being invited to Sunday dinner. The next morning, Klaus woke early. He washed carefully at the communal sinks. He cleaned his POW uniform as best as he could, scrubbing the worst stains with cold water and soap. The uniform was plain gray with PW painted on the back in black letters. Prisoner of war. It marked him as the enemy, but Eleanor Morrison had invited the enemy to her table. Sunday morning at Camp Ellis was quieter than weekdays. Some prisoners attended a church service held by a Lutheran pastor who volunteered at the camp. Others slept late or played chess or wrote letters home. Klaus sat on his bunk and tried to calm his nerves. You are really going? Friedrich asked. She invited me. It would be rude to refuse. Can I come? She invited me. Not us. Ottolita cigarette. You are a fool, but you always were too trusting. That is why you are here and not dead. At 1:30, a guard came to escort Klaus to the Morrison farm. It was the same guard as always, a young corporal named Jimmy who looked barely 20. He seemed amused by the whole situation. First time I have escorted a prisoner to a dinner party, Jimmy said in English. Klaus did not understand most of the words, but he understood the smile. They drove through the town. It was Sunday, and the churches were letting out. Families in their best clothes walked along the sidewalks. Children ran ahead while mothers called after them. Church bells rang across the town. Everything looked peaceful, normal, untouched by the war that was consuming Europe and the Pacific. The truck turned onto the dirt road leading to the Morrison farm. Klaus's heart pounded. His mouth was dry. He had flown combat missions over North Africa. He had dodged British anti-aircraft fire. He had crash-landed in the desert and been captured by soldiers who could have shot him. But somehow, walking up to a farmhouse for Sunday dinner terrified him more than any of that. The truck stopped. Jimmy gestured for Klaus to get out. 2 hours, Jimmy said, pointing at his watch. I will wait here. Klaus walked slowly toward the house. The front door was painted red. There were flowers in pots on the porch, dead now from the November cold. He could smell something cooking inside, something that made his stomach growl with hunger. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Through the window, he could see the Morrison family setting the table. Robert in his Sunday clothes. Eleanor in a nice dress. A teenage girl who must be their daughter. And that photograph on the mantel, watching over everything. Their son, the soldier, the enemy of Germany. Klaus knocked on the door before he could change his mind. The sound echoed in the quiet Sunday afternoon. He heard footsteps inside. The door opened. Eleanor Morrison smiled at him. Come in, Klaus. Welcome to our home. Klaus stepped through the doorway and into a world he had almost forgotten existed. The Morrison home smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread. A fire crackled in the fireplace. Lace curtains hung in the windows. Family photographs covered the walls, showing generations of Morrisons on this same farm. It was so normal, so peaceful, that Klaus felt like he'd stepped through a door into the past before the war had started. "This is my husband, Robert," Eleanor said, gesturing to the tall man Klaus knew from the farm. Robert nodded and extended his hand. Klaus hesitated, then shook it. A German officer shaking hands with an American farmer. 6 months ago, this would have been unthinkable. "And this is our daughter, Mary." The teenage girl smiled shyly. She had her mother's brown hair and her father's height. She looked about 14 or 15. "Hello," Mary said in careful German. "Welcome." Klaus blinked in surprise. "You speak German?" "A little. I am learning at school." Her accent was even worse than her mother's, but the effort touched something in Klaus's chest. They moved to the dining room. The table was set with white plates and real silverware. Klaus could not remember the last time he had seen a table set so nicely. In the barracks, they ate from metal trays with spoons. Before that, in North Africa, they had eaten from tin cans while sand blew into everything. The table was covered with food: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, a bowl of butter, gravy in a ceramic boat. It was more food than Klaus had seen in months, maybe years. He thought about Germany, where everything was rationed now, where people stood in lines for hours to buy a single loaf of bread, where children went hungry. And here was this feast, and they were sharing it with a German prisoner. Robert Morrison stood at the head of the table. "We say grace before we eat," he explained in simple English. Eleanor translated into German. Klaus nodded. His own family had said grace before meals, back when the world was normal, back before the war. He bowed his head. Robert spoke in English, his voice deep and calm. Klaus understood only some of the words, but he understood the tone. Eleanor translated quietly. "Lord, thank you for this food. Thank you for bringing us together in peace. Watch over all those who are far from home. Watch over those who serve in distant lands. Bring them safely back to those who love them. Amen." Klaus felt his throat tighten. The prayer had included him. A German pilot who had dropped bombs on British positions. A German pilot whose comrades were shooting at American soldiers. The prayer had asked God to protect him too. "Amen," Klaus whispered. They sat down, and Eleanor began serving the food. She put a chicken leg on Klaus's plate, then potatoes, then beans. The portions were generous, not the tiny servings he got at camp. Klaus stared at his plate, overwhelmed. "Please eat," Robert said. Gesturing, Klaus picked up his fork and took a bite of the chicken. It was seasoned with herbs he could not identify, cooked until it was tender and juicy. It was the best thing he had tasted since before the war. He had to force himself not to eat too fast, not to shovel the food into his mouth like a starving animal. The first few minutes were awkward. They ate in silence, the only sounds being the clink of silverware on plates and the crackling of the fire. Then Mary broke the silence. "What is Germany like?" she asked in her careful, clumsy German. "I've seen pictures in books, but what is it really like?" Klaus looked at Eleanor, uncertain if he should answer. She nodded encouragingly. "Germany is—" Klaus paused, searching for simple words. "Germany is old. Very old. My city, Dresden, has buildings that are hundreds of years old. Churches with tall towers. Bridges over the river. In December, we have Christmas markets where people sell toys and candy and hot wine." "That sounds beautiful," Mary said. "It was beautiful," Klaus corrected quietly. "Now there are bombs. British planes come at night. American planes come during the day. The old buildings are burning." The table went silent. Klaus realized he had said too much. He had reminded them that Germany was the enemy, that Germans were bombing London just as the Allies were bombing German cities. But then Robert spoke. "War is terrible for everyone," he said simply. Eleanor translated. "Soldiers do not start wars. Politicians start wars. Soldiers just try to survive them." Klaus looked up at Robert, surprised. In Germany, you could not say such things. The Nazi Party controlled everything. You repeated the propaganda, or you stayed silent. But here, in this farmhouse in Illinois, Robert Morrison spoke freely. "Your son," Klaus said carefully, gesturing toward the photograph on the mantel. "Where is he?" Eleanor's smile faltered. "James is in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. We got a letter 2 weeks ago. He is on an island called Tarawa. She pronounced it slowly, carefully, as if the name might break. Klaus did not know where Tarawa was, but he knew about the Pacific War. The Japanese were Germany's allies, but Klaus had never met a Japanese soldier. The war in the Pacific seemed like a different war on a different planet. But it was the same war. The same stupid, terrible war. I hope he comes home safe, Klaus said, and he meant it. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the table and squeezed Klaus's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. They finished the meal, and Eleanor brought out dessert. Apple pie with a flaky crust and cinnamon sugar on top. Klaus had not eaten pie since he was a child visiting his grandmother's house in Bavaria. The sweetness exploded in his mouth, and for a moment, he was 8 years old again, safe and happy and innocent. After dessert, Robert offered Klaus a cigarette. They sat on the porch while Eleanor and Mary cleaned the dishes. The November sun was setting, painting the cornfields gold and orange. Somewhere far away, men were dying. Ships were sinking. Cities were burning. But here on this porch, there was just the sound of crickets and the smell of cigarette smoke. "Why did you invite me?" Klaus asked in his broken English. Robert thought for a long moment. "Because you're not the enemy. Hitler is the enemy. The Nazi Party is the enemy. But you? You are just a young man far from home, same as my son. If James is captured, I hope some kind family feeds him dinner and treats him like a human being." Klaus did not have words to respond. In his 2 years as a soldier, nobody had ever said anything like this to him. The Nazi officers had taught him that Germans were superior, that other races and nations were inferior. But Robert Morrison was teaching him something different. Something about common humanity. Something about mercy that, as the sun set. Eleanor came out with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you and your friends," she said. "Cookies, soap, and a note." Klaus took the package, his hands trembling. "Thank you. I do not know what to say." "Say you will come back next Sunday," Mary called from the doorway, grinning. Klaus smiled despite himself. "Maybe." The guard truck returned at 4 o'clock. Klaus walked down the porch steps, carrying the package. At the bottom, he turned back. The Morrison family stood in the doorway, backlit by the warm light from inside their home. They waved. Klaus waved back. On the drive back to camp, he sat in silence. The package rested on his lap. Inside were cookies, soap, and a note written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. The note was in English, but Klaus could guess what it said. Something about kindness. Something about hope. Something that contradicted everything the war had taught him about enemies and hatred. When he returned to the barracks, Friedrich and Otto crowded around him. "Well," Friedrich demanded, "was it a trap?" Klaus opened the package and showed them the cookies. "No," he said quietly, "not a trap, just dinner." But it was more than dinner, and he knew it. It was something that would change everything. The cookies did not last long. Klaus, Friedrich, and Otto sat on their bunks that Sunday night and ate them slowly, savoring every bite. Other prisoners gathered around, asking questions. "Where did you get these? What happened at the dinner? What were they like?" Klaus tried to explain, but words failed him. How could he describe the way Eleanor Morrison had prayed for all soldiers, including him? How could he explain Robert Morrison's words about common humanity? It sounded impossible, even to his own ears. That be why Monday morning, the whole barracks knew about the Sunday dinner. By Tuesday, the whole camp knew. Some prisoners were jealous. Others were suspicious. A few accused Klaus of collaborating with the enemy. But most were simply curious. They wanted to know if Americans were really as soft and foolish as the propaganda claimed, or if something else was happening here. That week, something changed at the farm. Robert Morrison asked Klaus, through gestures and simple words, if Friedrich and Otto could join for Sunday dinner next week. Klaus translated the invitation. Friedrich accepted immediately, his young face bright with excitement. Otto grumbled and complained, but finally agreed. The second Sunday dinner was less awkward than the first. Mary Morrison had learned a few more German phrases. Eleanor served pot roast this time, with carrots and potatoes. Robert talked about farming, about how the war had taken all the young men and left the old men and women to do the work. Klaus talked about his training as a pilot, carefully avoiding any details that might be military secrets. After dinner, Mary played the piano. She was not very good, hitting wrong notes and fumbling the rhythm, but she played a song Klaus recognized from his childhood, a folk song that existed in both German and English. Klaus found himself humming along. When they returned to camp that evening, they found that other prisoners had been invited to other farms. A man named Werner had eaten dinner with a family named Peterson. Another prisoner, Hans, had been invited by a family named Schmidt who were German immigrants themselves. The ripple was spreading. Colonel Patterson called a meeting of all prisoners the next day. He stood before them, his expression serious. "Some American families are inviting prisoners to their homes," he said through the translator. "This is their choice. It is not required. But if you are invited, you'll follow rules. You will be respectful. You will cause no trouble. You will not discuss military information. You will not try to escape. Any prisoner who breaks these rules will lose all privileges." Understood. The prisoners nodded. Klaus noticed that Patterson looked tired, as if the war was aging him faster than the years, but not everyone in the town approved. Klaus saw it the next Sunday when the truck drove through town on the way to the Morrison farm. A group of people stood on the corner, holding signs. Klaus could not read English well, but he understood the angry faces and pointing fingers. Eleanor later explained that one sign said, "No Nazi lovers," and another said, "Remember our boys." A woman named Mrs. Henderson was the loudest protester. Her son had been killed at Normandy Beach in France just 6 months earlier. She stood outside the church every Sunday, shouting at anyone who showed kindness to German prisoners. Klaus understood her hatred. If his sister had been killed by American soldiers, would he not feel the same rage? One afternoon in early December, Klaus witnessed an argument in the town square. Mrs. Henderson confronted Eleanor Morrison outside the general store. Klaus was loading supplies into the farm truck and could hear the shouting. "Your son is risking his life while you feed the enemy." Mrs. Henderson yelled, "My boy is dead because of them." Eleanor's voice was quieter but firm. "My son is risking his life for freedom and mercy, not for revenge." "I'm sorry about your son, Margaret. Truly. But hating these young men will not bring him back. They are Germans. They are Nazis. They are prisoners. They are far from home. They are someone's sons, too." Mrs. Henderson spat on the ground and walked away. Eleanor stood there, trembling but unbowed. Klaus pretended he had not heard, but his respect for Eleanor Morrison grew even deeper. She was willing to face her own community's anger to do what she believed was right. As December arrived, news from the war fronts became harder to ignore. The Allies had landed in Italy. The Russians were pushing west, driving the German army back. American bombers were hitting German cities day and night. The prisoners in Camp Ellis received heavily censored letters from home, full of black marks where the censors had removed information. Klaus got a letter from his mother that was more black ink than words, but he could read between the lines. Dresden was being bombed regularly now. His family had lost their home. They were living with relatives. Klaus sat on his bunk, holding the letter, and cried. Friedrich, who slept in the next bunk, said nothing. What was there to say? The war was destroying everything. That Sunday, Klaus told Robert Morrison about his family. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, smoking cigarettes in the cold December air. Klaus's English had improved enough to communicate simple ideas. "My mother, my sister, they have no home now. Bombs destroyed it." Robert was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry, truly sorry. No family should suffer like this. It is war," Klaus said bitterly. "Germany bombs England. America bombs Germany. Everyone suffers." "Yes," Robert agreed. "Everyone suffers. That is why it must end." But the war showed no signs of ending. If anything, it was intensifying. In the Pacific, James Morrison's letters described brutal fighting on tiny islands that nobody had heard of before the war. In Europe, the Allies were preparing for a massive invasion of France. Everyone knew it was coming. The question was when and where. Christmas approached, and Camp Ellis buzzed with unexpected news. The camp commander was allowing a special Christmas service where prisoners and local townspeople could worship together. A Lutheran minister named Reverend Larson had proposed the idea. Some townspeople protested loudly. Others supported it. The commander approved it anyway, that on Christmas Eve, Klaus and 200 other German prisoners walked under guard to the town church. The building was old, built by German immigrants in the 1870s. Inside, American families sat on one side of the aisle. German prisoners sat on the other. The division was clear, visible, symbolic. Reverend Larson stood at the pulpit. He spoke in English first, then in German. Tonight, we celebrate the birth of the Prince of Peace. In a world at war, we remember that God's love extends to all people, German and American, prisoner and free, enemy and friend. Tonight, there are no enemies in this church, only children of God. The organist began to play. Klaus recognized the melody immediately. Silent Night. The song had been written in German, in Austria, over 100 years ago. The American side of the church began singing in English. The German side began singing in German. The same song, the same melody, in two different languages. Klaus sang, his voice cracking with emotion. Around him, hard men who had fought in terrible battles sang with tears running down their faces. Across the aisle, American families sang with their own tears. For 3 minutes, the war did not exist. For 3 minutes, there was only music and shared humanity. After the service, families invited prisoners to Christmas dinner. Klaus, Friedrich, and Otto went to the Morrison home. Mary had decorated cookies with red and green icing. Eleanor had roasted a turkey. Robert had brought out a bottle of wine he had been saving since before the war. They ate and laughed and sang carols. Klaus helped Mary decorate more cookies, his large pilot's hands clumsy with the small icing tubes. He felt happy, genuinely happy, for the first time in years. Then the guilt crashed over him like a wave. How dare he be happy while the war raged? How dare he laugh while his mother lived in ruins? How dare he feel peace while his countrymen died? Eleanor noticed his change in mood. "What is wrong? I should not be happy," Klaus said quietly. "People are dying." Eleanor squeezed his shoulder. "Being happy does not mean you do not care about suffering. It means you remember that life is worth living. That is why we fight wars, is it not? To protect the possibility of happiness." Klaus had no answer for that on January 15th, news reached Camp Ellis that shook everyone. The Morrison family received a telegram. James had been wounded in the Philippines. Shrapnel from a Japanese grenade. He would live, but he was being sent home to recover. When Klaus heard the news, he asked permission to visit the Morrison farm on a Sunday, even though it was not his assigned work day. The guard agreed. Klaus walked to the farmhouse and knocked on the door. Eleanor answered, her eyes red from crying. "I heard about James," Klaus said. "I'm sorry he was hurt, but I'm glad he is coming home." Eleanor embraced him, and Klaus stood there awkwardly, this German pilot being hugged by an American mother whose son had been wounded by Germany's allies. The absurdity of it, the beauty of it, the tragedy of it all mixed together until Klaus could not tell what he was feeling anymore. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor whispered. "Thank you for caring." And Klaus realized that he did care. Somewhere between that first Sunday dinner and now, these people had stopped being the enemy and started being his friends. Spring came to Illinois, but the news from Europe was dark. The Allies had landed in France on D-Day in June 1944. American, British, and Canadian soldiers fought through France toward Germany. The Russians pushed from the east. Germany was being crushed between two massive armies. In the barracks at Camp Ellis, prisoners listened to the radio broadcasts and knew the truth. Germany was losing the war. Some prisoners refused to believe it. They insisted it was Allied propaganda, that Germany had secret weapons that would turn the tide. But Klaus knew better. He had seen the endless stream of American trucks and tanks and planes. He had seen the factories that covered the American landscape, producing war materials faster than Germany could dream of. The outcome was inevitable. Then came May 8th, 1945. A guard walked into the barracks with a radio. He sat on a table and turned up the volume. The announcement came in German. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was over. The barracks erupted in chaos. Some men cheered with relief that the killing had finally stopped. Others wept, mourning the death of the nation they had served. A few became angry, shouting that it was lies, that Germany could not be defeated. Klaus sat on his bunk in silence, feeling nothing. No joy, no sadness, just emptiness. Germany had lost. Everything he had fought for, everything his comrades had died for, had been for nothing. Over the following weeks, more news filtered into the camp. This news was worse than anything Klaus could have imagined. The Allies had discovered camps, concentration camps, death camps, places where millions of Jews, Romani, disabled people, political prisoners, and others had been systematically murdered. The guard showed the prisoners newsreels of what the Allies had found. Mountains of bodies, gas chambers, crematoriums. Klaus watched the newsreel footage in horror. He had known about the camps, but he had believed they were just prison camps, like the POW camps. He had not known about the murders. Nobody had told him. Or maybe he had not wanted to know. Maybe he had chosen not to see. That night, Klaus went to the barn at the Morrison farm and broke down completely. He sobbed until he could not breathe. Robert Morrison found him there, curled up in the hay like a child. Robert did not ask questions. He just sat beside Klaus in silence until the worst of the grief had passed. "I did not know," Klaus whispered in German. "I did not know." Robert, who had learned some German over the past year, replied simply, "I believe you, but I serve that government. I wore the uniform. I am guilty. You serve your country. That is not the same as supporting those crimes. There is a difference between being a German soldier and being a Nazi." Klaus shook his head. "Is there? Where is the line? Did I cross it or not cross it?" Robert had no answer for that. How could he? There was no easy answer. Eleanor found them in the barn an hour later. She brought coffee and sandwiches. They sat together in the hay, eating in silence. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "You cannot change the past, Klaus. You cannot undo what was done. But you can choose who you want to be now. That choice matters." The words planted a seed in Klaus's mind. Who did you want to be? Not a Nazi. Never that. But not just a defeated soldier either. Something else. Something better. The months dragged on. The war in the Pacific ended in August after America dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Klaus learned about James Morrison's return home. He arrived in June, thin and scarred but alive. For weeks, Klaus avoided the Morrison farm, afraid to meet James face to face. What would they say to each other? They had been enemies. James had fought against Japan, but Germany and Japan were allies. The whole situation was complicated and painful. Finally, in July, Klaus could not avoid it any longer. He was working at the farm when James walked out of the house. He was 22 years old, with his mother's eyes and his father's height. He walked with a slight limp from his wounds. He stopped when he saw Klaus. They stared at each other across the farmyard. James spoke first in English. Klaus understood enough now to follow. "So you are the German my family has been feeding?" "Yes," Klaus replied carefully. "I am Klaus. My parents say you are a good worker. They say you are a good man." Klaus did not know how to respond to that. After everything that had happened, how could he claim to be a good man? James limped across the yard and extended his hand. "Any friend of my family is a friend of mine." Klaus shook his hand, amazed. This American soldier, who had been wounded by Germany's allies, was offering friendship to a German pilot. The mercy of it, the impossible mercy of it, nearly broke Klaus again. They worked side by side that day, James doing what he could despite his injury. They did not talk much. What was there to say? But by the end of the day, an understanding had formed between them. They were both young men who had survived a terrible war. That was enough. The months turned into a year. Klaus and the other prisoners waited to be sent home, but Europe was in chaos. Cities were destroyed. Governments had collapsed. Transportation systems were ruined. It would take time to sort everything out. Klaus used the time to learn English properly. He read American newspapers and books. He listened to the radio. He practiced speaking with the Morrison family every Sunday. His English became fluent, though he never lost his German accent. In early 1946, Klaus received news from home. His mother and sister had survived the war. Dresden was mostly destroyed, but they were alive. They were living in the rubble, trying to rebuild. His sister was engaged to a man who had lost his right arm in the war. His mother was working as a nurse in a makeshift hospital. They needed him home. Finally, In November 1946, over a year after the war had ended, Klaus and the other prisoners received their orders. They would be sent home in groups over the coming months. Klaus was scheduled to leave in January 1947, that his last Sunday at the Morrison farm was bittersweet. Eleanor cooked his favorite meal, pot roast with potatoes. Mary, now 16, played the piano beautifully, having practiced for 2 years. Robert gave Klaus a carved wooden box filled with seeds from the farm. "Plant these in Germany," Robert said. "Help things grow again." Eleanor gave Klaus their address, carefully written on good paper. "Write to us. Let us know you are safe. Let us know how you are." James gave Klaus a photograph of the family, taken that afternoon. They all stood together on the porch, smiling. Klaus was in the photograph too, standing beside them. "So you do not forget," James said simply. Klaus could barely speak through his tears. "I will never forget. Never." In January 1947, Klaus Hoffmann boarded a ship in New York Harbor with hundreds of other German prisoners. The ship sailed east, toward Europe, toward home, toward an uncertain future. Klaus stood on the deck and watched America disappear over the horizon. He thought about the Morrisons, about their impossible mercy, about how they had fed their enemy and treated him like family. The return to Germany was harder than Klaus had imagined. Dresden was in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. The beautiful churches and bridges he remembered from childhood were gone. His mother and sister lived in a basement apartment in a partially destroyed building. There was little food, little fuel, little hope, but Klaus had the seeds Robert had given him. And he had the memory of the Morrison family's kindness. And he had a purpose now that he began working with other Germans to rebuild. He used his English skills to help with the American and British occupation forces, serving as a translator. He worked in schools, teaching young Germans about the dangers of hatred and blind nationalism. He told them about Camp Ellis, about Illinois, about a farm family who had shown mercy when they could have shown hate. That in 1950, 5 years after the war had ended, Klaus sent a package to America. Inside was a hand-carved wooden angel, made by one of Dresden's few surviving craftsmen. The angel was in the style Dresden had been famous for before the war. It was beautiful and delicate and represented everything Dresden was trying to become again. The package arrived at the Morrison farm in February. Eleanor opened it carefully. Inside was the angel and a letter from Klaus. The letter was in English now, written in Klaus's careful handwriting. "Dear Morrison family," it read, "I'm alive and well. Dresden is slowly healing. I am teaching at a school, helping young Germans learn from our mistakes. I teach them about mercy and compassion and the danger of seeing other people as enemies rather than as human beings. I teach them by telling them about your family, about how you fed your enemy and treated him with kindness when you had every reason to hate. You changed my life. You showed me that there is another way. Thank you. Always. Your friend, Klaus." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. She carried the angel to the mantel and placed it beside James's photograph. The German angel and the American soldier, side by side. Enemies once, friends now. Robert put his arm around his wife's shoulders. Mary, now 18 and preparing to go to college, read the letter over her mother's shoulder. James, home from a war and working the farm with his father, smiled quietly. "Do you think it mattered?" Eleanor asked. "Do you think one Sunday dinner really changed anything?" Robert looked at the angel on the mantel, at the letter in his wife's hand, and thought about all the other families who had invited prisoners to their homes. He thought about all the small acts of mercy that had rippled out across the years. "Yes," he said firmly, "I think it mattered very much." Somewhere in Germany, Klaus Hoffmann stood in front of a classroom of young students. He told them about the war, about the mistakes his generation had made, about the price of hatred. And then he told them about an American farm family who had invited their enemy to Sunday dinner. "Remember this," Klaus said to his students. "The enemy is just a person who has been taught to hate you. But hate can be unlearned. Mercy can change the world. I know this because mercy changed me." The students listened, and some of them understood. And that understanding, that small seed of compassion planted in young hearts, would grow and spread and help ensure that the horrors of the past would not be repeated. Point one Sunday dinner had become a story. That story had become a lesson. That lesson had become hope. And hope, Klaus had learned, was the most powerful weapon against darkness. The war had ended years ago, but the work of peace would continue for generations.